In this video, I want to show you how to add in authentication into a React Native application. Now, specifically, we're going to take a look at how to add in login and logout functionality, as well as persisting our user state, so we don't have to sign in every single time we open up our application. Now, there are a few things I want to cover before we get started. First, we are going to be using Appwrite to manage our users. And if you don't know what Appwrite is, it's a full backend as a service platform that also provides client and server SDKs to interact with these backend services. But specifically, we just want to focus on the user management part of Appwrite. Now, for the React Native application, I already have a project set up and ready to go that I'm going to build on top of. And if you want to follow along and use the same exact code that I have, in the next step, I'll quickly show you how to clone this GitHub repo and how to set up this starter code. So this way you can pick up exactly where I left off. Now, this code base was actually created in a previous video. So if you want to follow along with this playlist, in the last video, we created our protected routes inside of our React Native application, and we used React context for this. So for now, our user values are hard-coded, and we either redirect a user to our login page or let them see private routes depending on that user status. So now it's time to actually really log in a user and really persist that state. So this right here is the project code that we're going to use. Now, we're going to clone this repo, but we want to make sure that we get this specific branch right here. So there's multiple ways of doing this, but let's go ahead and open up our terminal. And from here, we want to run git clone -b. Then we want to specify the branch name, paste in the repo URL, and hit enter. Now that we have the project cloned, let's go ahead and cd into the folder. And from here, we'll just want to run npm install and just make sure we have all the default dependencies this project already has. Now, before we review our code, let's go ahead and run npm start. And this way we can see our project and just make sure everything's working. So I'm using the iOS emulator, so I'll press I to open that up. And while that's being opened, let's go ahead and open up our folders and files, and we're going to do a full review here. So if you did everything correctly, you're going to see this page right here. So it's just a sign-in form. So let's start by taking a look at that. So inside of the app folder, we have our signin.jsx file. And in here, we have a basic login form. So our text input fields for our password and email. Here we have a handle submit function that at this point doesn't have anything. We'll take care of this. And then we have our email and password state, as well as our session from our custom hook that I created in the last video. So this is called use auth. Here we get a session, and then we use this session. So if we're logged in, we don't want the user on the login page. So we redirect them to the home page, or that route. Now, from here, let's go ahead and go into the layout file here. So in the layout, this is the root layout file. We have two of them at this point. We wrap this inside of our auth provider. This is how we can pass down the session and user state and any other global data that we want to pass down. Now, inside of the route group here, we also have another layout, and this is what's wrapped inside of that main layout file. And in this one, we're just getting the user session. And to create our protected routes, we first check, and if we don't have a session, we redirect our user to our sign-in page. If we do have one, then we continue on and we let the user continue to where they were going. Now, inside of our homepage here, we have our index.tsx. And at this point, I just minimized this and I just made sure that we're just saying you're logged in. I removed any other functionality in this page and I try to make it as simple as possible. So that's all we're doing. We're saying you're logged in, or we render out the login form. Now, inside of our context, let's go ahead and check this out. So we have our auth context. Here we create the context. We set our state, so loading state, session state, user state. Then we have our sign in and sign out functions that don't have any functionality yet. Then we take all these functions and data. We pass this down through our auth context provider. And then we just simply either render out the loading state or the actual children. Now here, this is where we create our custom hook. So we're using use auth inside of our application everywhere. This allows us to use our context data a lot easier. So we create this custom hook and that just simplifies everything. Now, before we do anything with authentication, we want to make sure we have some users set up in our provider. We want to make sure the SDK is connected. So in this next step, what I'm going to do here is create my Appwrite backend and add in some user data to actually log in with these users. Now, you can always use Appwrite as a self-hosted option. What I'm going to do here is use Appwrite Cloud, and Appwrite Cloud has a very generous free tier. So you can have up to 75,000 monthly active users. I would say that's a pretty generous free tier, and that'll be more than enough for our project. So when you go to the website, go ahead and create a new account here. And from this point, you'll want to create an organization. Within your organization, you're going to want to create a new project. So I'm going to go ahead and create this project here. I'm going to call this My App, and this is going to generate an entire project with a project ID. Now I'm going to select a region. We'll click on Create. And once my project is set up, I'm going to go into the Auth tab. We're not going to use any of the other Appwrite services. We just want to use the user management system here. So let's go ahead and create a user and add in whatever data you want here. I'm going to create a username, email, and password, and make sure that you actually have this information saved. So you'll want to use this later when you actually log in. If you forget it, you can always reset the password here or just create another user. Okay, so I have my user set up. So if I go to the Auth tab here, I can see the single user in my application. So what I want to do next here is go ahead and create my configuration for the SDK. So within Appwrite, I can select multiple client SDKs here. So I can use the Web SDK, Flutter, Android, Apple. Here we have the React Native option. Now with React Native, typically you're going to want to add in an Android and iOS option. Right now, I'm going to stick to the iOS option. If you're using Android, go ahead and create a package name here. Give it a name. I'm going to use iOS, so I'm going to call this My iOS App. And I need to create a bundle ID. Now, with iOS apps, it's common to use like a reverse domain option. So I'll use com.dennis.app. So I just want to make sure this is saved. So I want to remember what this bundle ID is. Then I can go ahead and hit next. And at this point, we're going to manually set this up. So we just want to continue this. And we just want to make sure that we add in our iOS SDK, and this will be under platforms. So if you see this, that means it's set up. If you're using Android and iOS, make sure you add both. So I've set up my backend, and what I want to do here is go ahead and install the SDK. So what I'm going to do is run npm i, and then we're going to install React Native Appwrite. And this will install the specific SDK we need for React Native here. So once that's installed, I'm going to go ahead and close out this terminal option right here, and I'm going to set up my environment variables. So I have this env.example file. So if you use that source code, all these are already in here. So what I need to do from here is create the official env folder. I will paste all these in, and I need to get some credentials from my Appwrite backend. So I want to make sure I get the endpoint URL, project ID, and I don't need the database ID actually, so I'll just leave these empty. But I do need the package name and bundle ID, depending on whether I'm using iOS or Android. So to get these, let's go ahead and actually go into our project. And under the Overview tab, this is where I can grab my project ID. I can also get this from the Settings tab. Here is that ID. So I'll go ahead and paste this into project ID. Then for the endpoint, I'm using Appwrite Cloud. So I'm going to paste that one in. And then for our bundle ID, this was com.dennis.app. So that's it for my environment variables, at least up until this point. We just needed our endpoint, project ID, and bundle ID. And what I want to do next here is actually configure the Appwrite SDK. So I'm going to put this into its own folder called lib, and we'll call this Appwrite config.js. Now in here, let's go ahead and make a few imports here. So we want to import client, and we also want to import account. And this is going to be coming from React Native Appwrite. And we also want to import platform, and we'll see why we need this in a second here. And this is coming from React Native. So first thing is I want to create my client instance. This is going to be new client. And with this, I also need to go ahead and set the endpoint. So we'll set endpoint, and this is going to come from process.env.expo. And in fact, what I can do is just go ahead and grab this endpoint right here, and we'll paste that in like that. So we want to set the endpoint. Then we want to set the project ID. So project like that, and it's going to be the same thing. This is coming from process.env, and we'll get Expo project ID. And this is going to set up that core configuration. Now, what we also want to do here is we need to set a platform, but we don't know what platform the user is currently joining our application from. So we want to create a condition here. So we're going to check what platform the user has, and we can call platform.os. And this is going to allow us to create a condition so we can continue configuring this client instance. So first we want to check the case. So if the case is iOS, then what we'll do is we'll call client.setPlatform. And here we can just go ahead and get that value here for the actual endpoint. So we want to get the bundle ID if this is iOS. So we'll call process.env, and then we're going to set the bundle ID. Now we can also create another case after this. So I'll just minimize this so we actually have some space. So if the case is Android, then we can continue on and do the same thing. So we'll go ahead and set the platform here, and this would be the package name. So depending on what you're using, eventually you'd want to set both of these up. So this sets up the platform, the endpoint, and the project ID, and that configures our client instance. Now, from this point, we want to go ahead and create our account instance, and this is where we can actually use the functionality that signs in our user, creates sessions, and so on. So this is coming from account, and here we need to pass in our client instance. So that sets up the account and allows us to do all authentication related aspects here. So we're going to do export, and we'll throw in account. And what I'm going to do here is just make it a named export like that. Now, before we move on, I almost forgot to add in the break at the end of each case here. So let's make sure to add that. That's quite important. So that's it for our Appwrite configuration. Now we can actually start using this within our project here. So what I'm going to do is close all this out. Then we'll go into context here. Inside of auth context, this is where the magic is going to happen. So the first thing we're going to do is work on the sign in functionality here. So we're going to use this function right here. So first we want to import account. This is what we just created. And this is coming from the lib folder. And we're going into appwrite config.js. So we just created this, and then inside of the sign in function, in order to kick off this process, we want to set loading to true. And then we're going to create a try catch here. And for now, we'll just console out the error if we have one. So we want to simplify this. Now in the try statement, the first thing we're going to do is create an email password session. And here, in order to create the session, we're just going to pass in the email and password that we have passed in from the form. So when we call this function here, we just want to make sure that we get our email and password. So we want to destructure that. So we'll pass those through. And with this function, we're also going to get a response here. So we're going to call this response session, and we'll call await like that. So this right here will be the session that gets created when we call this function. Now, once we create the session, we're going to call set session. Then we're going to pass in the response session to update our state. And from here, we also want to get the user. So we have our session that has some user data, but has more information about the session. Then we want to actually get that user data, and we'll call this response user, and we'll call await here. And this is going to be called account.get. So if we have a session, it's going to go ahead and get the current user. Then we can call set user. And here we're going to pass in the response user. And once this is all complete, then we just want to make sure loading is set to false. So we basically want to complete this process here. And that right here sets everything up for us. Now we want to go ahead and trigger this. So let's go into the sign-in page here. And here we're already calling useAuth, which gives us access to the session that's being passed down. Now we also pass in the sign-in function as well. So we have access to that. We can pass this through and go ahead and call this. So here we're passing down session, then we're going to call sign in. We also want to pass that down. And inside of the handle submit function, so once this function is triggered, here we have the event listener that listens for the press of this button right here. We call handle submit. And in here, let's just go ahead and call sign in. And we just want to pass in the email and password. So as we're typing, we're updating the state, and we're passing that through on submission. So we can actually test this. Now the issue here is we're not persisting our state. So right now, if I sign in, so I have my user, I believe the name is DennisIV@email.com. And then my password was password123. So we'll log in. So that logs in my user, and that takes care of the first part of this application. So we're actually signed in. Now there's a few things that are still unfinished here. So first of all, if I refresh this, even though we're logged in, I still see this login form. So right now we're actually not persisting a session. Now, if we go into our Appwrite console, if we go to this user, we can go into the sessions tab and we can see that we actually have a session here. So there is a valid session. So next, what we need to do is actually get this session and then make sure that anytime we open this up, we pull down that session and make sure it's loaded into our auth state here. So we want to get the session and get the user on the first load anytime our application is opened. So to persist our user, we're going to create a few functions here. So we're first going to call a check auth function, and we'll make sure this is an async function. And this function will be responsible for making sure that we have a session and then retrieving that session as well as getting the currently logged in user. Now, what we want to do is also call the init function. And the init function is where we're going to kick things off in our application. So anything we want to be called on the initial load, we want to trigger within the init function. So check auth is going to go ahead and kick things off, or init is going to kick things off, and then it's going to call check auth. And then for this, we want to do this by calling use effect. So when our application first loads, we're going to call use effect, and we just want to make sure that we trigger this right away. We'll throw in an empty dependency array, and we're going to call init. So init triggers check auth. That's how we're going to make sure the hierarchy looks. So inside of check auth here, first of all, I want to make sure that loading state is now set to true. So when we first load our application, we should see loading. I know it's a little bit small right there, but now we're in a persistent loading state. And this check auth function is what's going to change that. So inside of check auth, what we'll do here is first create a try catch statement, and we'll just make sure we'll throw in the catch here, and we want to make sure to console out the error. Now, in a real application, you might want to make sure this is actually represented somewhere within your UI, but we just want to simplify this and make sure that we see the error. Now, once this is done, we'll set loading to false. So right now, this is going to update that, and there we go. Now, in the try statement, first thing we want to do is get a session. So we're going to call a response session. And in order to get a session, we're going to call await, and this is coming from account.get session. And to get a session, we can just go ahead and pass in an ID. We can look for a specific session, or we can just call current. And what this is going to do is, if we have a session persisted, it's going to go ahead and retrieve that, and it's going to use the session that we currently have set inside of local storage. Now, from here, I can just go ahead and call set session, and we can throw in the response. Now, I also want my user, so we're going to call response user, and this is coming from await account.get, like that. And that's going to get my current user. If we have one, then we can call set user, and we throw in response user. So now if I save this, we are now logged in because we did indeed create a session. We do have a session stored. So on that initial load, we're getting that, and now we're permanently logged in. So we kind of face a different issue now. So now we're logged in, but we also want to be able to log out. So what I'm going to do here is go ahead and quickly set up a sign out button. We're going to put this in here, and I originally thought that I did, but the updated code that you download will already have this. So I'm just going to go ahead and create this real quick. We'll pause the video, we'll get back into it, and then we're going to add in the functionality into that sign in button. Okay, so we're back. I added this button. Again, you don't have to worry about this because if you clone the GitHub repo that was provided, this will already be in the updated code. So here's the button right here, and there's just some button styling. So it was a really quick update. And now what we want to do is go ahead and add in the functionality into this sign out button here. So in here, let's just go ahead and build this in. So first we want to set loading to true. We want to kick things off that way. So anytime someone clicks sign in or sign out, we want to set that loading state. Then we're going to call account.delete session here. And here we can also just go ahead and pass in current. That'll delete the session. Then we're going to set session to, let's see, this is going to be null. And we want to set our user to null as well. So we just want to clear everything. And then we'll set loading to false. So that's it. All we do is call account delete session, and that'll remove it, and that'll also remove it from our Appwrite console. Now, I already passed down this function here. So inside of index.tsx here, so this is that home page, we can just go ahead and import use auth. That's coming from context, auth context. Then I just want to go ahead and get that sign out function. And here we'll also just go ahead and get the user as well. And this is all coming from use auth. So we'll just say you're logged in, And let's just get the current user. So let's just say hello, and we'll pass in the user name. So we'll just do user name like that. So now we see Dennis Ivy. That is indeed the user that I have in my console here. So we see the actual user. And then what we want to do is go ahead and update this button. So on press, we just want to go ahead and call sign out. And that's going to go ahead and just sign out my user. So now if I save this, let's go ahead and log out. We log out. I'm going to re-enter my credentials. Let's just log in. And it looks like everything works. So we're going to check one more thing here. So now if I refresh it, we now persist that login state. We're checking the user and we have full functionality. So let's go ahead and actually log out and let's just check the console. So here's that session. If I refresh it, the session is deleted from my local storage, but it also should be deleted from this user sessions right here. So now here, if I have multiple sessions within different applications, we'll see all of those here, but those will also deleted from my console as well. So that does it for this video. Now, I was planning to add user registration, and I still might follow up with a video on that. If you leave me a comment down in the comment section telling me that you want to see user registration with React Native, I can do that, but I figured that looking through the docs, you'll understand the functionality is pretty much exactly what we just completed, just with a different function, but I'll leave that up to you. So that's it for this video. Make sure to give it a like, subscribe to the Appwrite YouTube channel, and I'll see you all in the next one.